How big a problem is wealth inequality between the generations in Britain today?
Good afternoon, Ali. Thank you for covering this issue. It's rare that an issue like this is sort of discussed in open. It's almost like, as a country, I think we're sleepwalking into an inequality of wealth crisis. I do think this is serious for all those statistics you've just mentioned, but it's also damaging in so many ways when it comes to how society works. It's damaging because there are generations of young people who are losing hope. They feel increasingly insecure because they don't have access to a property, a home to buy, a place to live in that they can call home. It's damaging in terms of the influence that very wealthy people then have on policy and politics. It's damaging in terms of the environment. You might not think it, but the vast number of the majority of emissions from flying, for example, come from a relatively small number of people who happen to be wealthy, who've got a lot of time and are spending their time traveling around the world. So whether it's social, it's economic, it's environmental, I think there are some huge issues, and we talk too rarely about wealth inequality, I find.
I agree with you, and that's why I wanted to bring the conversation forward. There's a very interesting piece, an LSE blog that was written by Will Snell of the Fairness Foundation in October last year, entitled "The UK's Wealth Gap Poses a Strategic Risk to the Nation." I mean, it's basically alluding to the potential for civil unrest. I mean, how serious is this, and where do you think it could end up?
Yeah, I think it is incredibly serious. But Ali, just before we get to that, one thing we should be clear about is, when we talk about baby boomers having all of this wealth, and I suspect there are baby boomers listening to you. The vast majority of those people did work hard for what they've earned, and and in some ways they're the generation that's probably worked hardest, because many of them had to work into their 60s or 70s. They worked at times when labor conditions, employment rights weren't particularly good. They worked long hours. And so, in some ways, I think society is paying the price for that sort of huge demographic shift, as well as a huge economic shift that happened. And those people who worked hard, earned that money, happened to see their assets increase in value, particularly property prices. And now we're going to have to learn how to readjust to that. And that's, it's difficult to do without sort of pointing the finger and blaming people. But on your point about unrest, we work with a group of very rich people, a group called Patriotic Millionaires.
Yeah.
And this, several hundred of the world's wealthiest people who are calling for higher taxes. And their very first sort of letter that they wrote together as a group years ago was called "Taxes, Not Pitchforks."
Yes.
And
Yes.
this is the thesis, not mine. It's their thesis that unless, as a society, we start to rebalance these inequalities and injustices, we will have pitchforks, that there will be social unrest, because if you lose hope, if you think that you can't ever get your foot on the ladder, that there's no prospect for you to accumulate that wealth, and you start resenting these people who have vulgar amounts of wealth that they can't even work out how to spend, that to me is a recipe for social unrest, and we owe it to ourselves to do something about it.
Well, indeed, they had a meeting at the Savoy Hotel not so long ago when they were talking about pitchforks and torches, because even the wealthiest in society, at least some of them, can understand that if some of these wealth inequalities are not addressed, it's heading to a very, very dark place. I mean, you mentioned the fact that there could also be impacts on the democratic system in terms of concentrations of power. When you have a situation where the top 1% in this country have 10% of the wealth, equivalent to the bottom 50% of the population, that is a worrying statistic, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And look, there's another bit of data that I wanted to bring up, which is we worked with that group, Patriotic Millionaires, and earlier this week published some polling. And it's fascinating polling because it's a poll done of millions. So we worked with a polling company to identify about 3,000 people around the world who've got net disposable wealth of more than a million US dollars. So that's, outside their home and the things that they need to use day to day. And we asked them whether they think wealth is damaging democracy. And guess what? More than half of them think that extreme wealth, these levels of wealth, is damaging democracy because rich people are buying influence. They're buying influence through donating to political parties. They're buying control of media and social media. We're seeing it in the US play out at the moment. And so, for democracy to function, you've got to have this sense that no one, everyone is equal, and that, it's one person, one vote, not £1, one vote. And increasingly, we're seeing this wealth inequality is starting to skew our democratic system, and it starts to the problems start to accumulate because the rich then protect their own interests by having low taxes on inheritance, for example. And well, lo and behold, that just means they get even more money. That then builds up even more pressure on the social fabric that holds us together.
Is the answer to this not what I was discussing in my first hour of my program, which is growth in the economy? You broaden the pie, you grow the size of the pie, and then everyone can have a stake in that. Why does it have to be built around redistribution, raw, hard redistribution from the wealthiest to others and intergenerationally, rather than growing the pie for everyone? And if the younger people want to work their socks off, they too can accumulate mass wealth.
Well, I think that, this is what economists call trickle-down theory, right? So this idea that if you grow the whole economy, that, eventually some of that wealth and prosperity will trickle down. The problem with that theory is that it's just not happening, right? Take the last 14 years in the UK. If you happen to be in the top 1% of wealth holders in the UK in 2010, then over the course of the last 14 years, you've seen your net average per capita wealth increase by £2.2 million. So if you happen to be in the top 1% in 2010, there's been all this wonderful growth. Your wealth has grown by more than £2 million per person. Meanwhile, for the vast majority of British people, as you said in your, just a few minutes ago, their wealth has actually been decreasing for younger people, for people out of work, and so on. And so, that's just one evidence, a piece of evidence. I can give you hundreds of pieces of evidence all around the world that this sort of ideology that we've been fed over the last few decades around the world, that, the state can just sort of sit back and watch the market work, and eventually every one of us will be better off. It's not happening here. It's not happening in the US. It's starting not to happen even in continental Europe, where the state is sort of pulling back. And so I do think we need to have a more active system of redistribution, not to be overly punitive of entrepreneurs and those people who are creating wealth, but to make sure that we can protect that social fabric.